What's going on, people? Pascal here, back with another episode of Rona Report. In this episode, I'm in Camden. I'm gonna go be Athian. He's a local youth MP for the borough. Let's go chat to him now. Tell people who you are and what you do.
So my name's Athian, I'm 17. I'm an activist from Camden, and a lot of my work is done around trying to change the narrative on knife crime. So I think the way that politicians normally talk about it is in terms of stop and search and policing.
Yeah.
But actually I want to talk about poverty, inequality, austerity, about all those things that they're neglecting for some dubious and questionable reasons. And so I've done that. So I've spoken in the House of Commons, I've done some writing for major newspapers and that sort of, and I've worked within my own community to sort of do that.
Okay. 54% of black people are getting stopped, searched and fined during coronavirus. So how does that affect the community and police relations?
I think we're in the middle of the pandemic, and there's never been a more important time for there to be trust between those who have power and those who are in the community. So the fact that the coronavirus legislation is disproportionately being used on black people will only mean that our communities won't trust the police. And that means at every stage of this pandemic, when trust between those who have power and those who are being governed is more important than ever, that means that will erode that trust, and it will be bad for everyone on both sides.
With the recent death of George Floyd, rest in peace, I've seen a lot of videos surfacing of police brutality, probably on men though. Recently, a woman called Breonna Taylor has died. So the question is, do black women's lives matter as well? Because it's not really being publicised when it happens to women, but with men it seems to be publicised.
I think, yeah, that raises a really important point. I think if we look at the police brutality against African Americans, we have to make sure that we stand up equally when it's both happening to men and women. And we need to make sure our own sort of biases and the problems with our society aren't projected onto that issue, because I think police brutality against men and women in America is something we should care about equally, and I think that is an important point that you've raised.
As we've seen in America, specifically, I think it was the place where George Floyd died. There's been a lot of rioting and a lot of protesting. Trump has said that he's going to bring army out on the road to, in his words, if the looting starts, the shooting starts. That in itself shows clear, what's the word I'm looking for? That itself shows clear neglect for the whole situation. So how do you think black people, not just as in that community, but as a whole, can stand up against discrimination without having to go about it that way?
I think there are several things. So in the specific case of George Floyd in America, I think it was reflective of not only bad police officers, but a policing system which mandates and authorises this type of action against unarmed African Americans. But the question of moving forward, I think there needs to be economic, social and political consequences for those who are involved in police brutality. So let's take all three. So politics, the mayors, senators, and all those who have power in America, whenever they fail to act on this type of thing, they should be voted out of power. If we look at the companies in America who are reliant on disproportionately black prison labour, we should stop buying from them. And when we look at social consequences, I think there's the example of that police officer who it's transpired since he had a history of police violence. At that point, he should have lost his job and faced criminal charges. But then there's also the example of other people. So there was a video of a black man who was threatened essentially by by a white person who threatened to call the police on him. And I think people like that, and she has since, but people like that should lose their jobs. So I think this is a question of really realising the power that we have as a community to force change and to drive the narrative around these various different issues.
What's that guy's name? Something Cummings, the guy.
Dominic Cummings.
Dominic Cummings, okay. speaking about people losing their job,
Yeah.
Dominic Cummings, the guy who has created this whole, stay at home, he padded all of it, right? He himself broke his own rule.
Yeah.
Now there's been a big debate in the media and on radio and in the news saying they should lose a job. Do you think he should lose a job?
I think 100% without any doubt he should lose his job. If you look at Dominic Cummings breaking the lockdown rules in many different ways, it's an example of the last decade of conservative rule. It's one rule for the rich and one rule for the poor, one rule for the powerful and one rule for the powerless. It's one rule for them and one rule for us. It's another example. If we look back at 2008, when there was a massive financial crisis, what the Conservative implemented was tax cuts for the rich and austerity for the poor. So this is an example of the government's most powerful advisor breaking their own rules and continuing as though nothing happened. It's really the worst things about the Conservative government put on display for everyone. And I think rightfully, people across the political spectrum are calling for him to leave, and I think he should do so.
Delving into that topic of austerity, we can't overspeak for other countries, but for Britain, with the whole NHS and they're struggling. Explain to the people specifically your view on it and how it is relevant in this country.
So I think if we look back to 2008, where we had one of the deepest and worst financial crises in human history, the response of the Conservative government was that austerity was the natural economic response, that we simply didn't have enough money. But this was complete nonsense. If we looked at it, austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity. So if you compare it to other countries across the world, which started a program of state interventionism, where the government started to fund people who'd lost their jobs so they could stay afloat while they found new jobs, instead here, the Conservatives who'd wanted to dismantle the welfare state for many years, they finally saw an opportunity to do so. So they saw the NHS and decided to cut its budget. They saw benefits and decided to cut that. They saw education and decided to cut that. Austerity is not something we have to do as a country. It's a choice made by the powerful who don't want to take care of the needs of ordinary people.
Okay. So lockdown has affected everyone's life drastically. Tell me personally, how's it affected you?
Yeah, so I think some of the structures that we have as young people are gone as a result of lockdown. I mean, we're not going to school, some people aren't going to work because their workplaces are closed. So I think there's that immediate short-term disruption, but then I think it's important that we also think about what's going to happen, what's coming next. Because I mean, there's massive disruption to the economy, there's disruption to people who are sitting exams this year. There needs to be a political consideration into how this lockdown has disrupted the lives of young people, both in the short term in these last 2 months and both in the longer term.
Yeah, so speaking about the long term, how do you think post-Rona, how do you think that's going to be? Because clearly, I don't know if it's going to be the same. I think this virus has impacted the whole world drastically. So what do you think is going to happen post-Rona?
I think the coronavirus has placed us at the crossroads of history. I think generally the way that we go after this crisis is going to be indicative of what we value in the world. We can use this crisis as a time to reconsider and challenge the injustices of the past. I mean, whether that's racism, inequality, poverty, or we can use it to simply go back to normal. I think we can't go back to normal. I think we need to look at the injustices that this crisis has brought to the surface and really tackle them head on to build a better world when this pandemic is over.
So, how do you think austerity specifically affects the young people like us and our provisions?
So I think there are several ways that austerity impacts young people. So if we look at schools, they've cut the budget for all forms of schools. They've really push people to do more with less money. And I think it's the same with youth services. If you ask a young person in 2007 the amount of youth services that they had to them, it was massively more than what they had now. And I think it's another example, the cut of youth services, why this government's approach is wrong. Because it's saving money at the earliest possible point, but actually leading up to having to spend more money. So if you have a young person and you provide them with opportunity and education, and they end up being productive and contributing to the world, that's much better than if we as a society say we don't want to support them, and instead they end up doing worse things. And I think it's a realization that it's not public expenditure, it's social investment.
Yeah, it seems like the people would rather look after themselves now than think about us. 'Cause at the end of the day, we're the next generation. When these lot die, it's us that have to deal with all their mess that they've left behind. So, in that sense, do you really think that the government really should support youth more, like build more youth centres? Because I remember when Grenfell burnt down, I remember reading in the newspaper that the debris mashed up a community centre. The guy from DIY SOS, he went and built a house over it to commemorate, to commemorate Grenfell. But clearly that, why would you not, with all your money and all your, your clout, whatever, you would want to build another community centre over it, you know?
I think that's a really good specific example of that failure to think about the people in the community and to consider the needs of the community, and instead just people doing what they individually want to. Because I think over the last 40 years we have an idea of society which is just about individuals and families, and we've really forgotten the idea of the collective and the community, and I think that's something we need to regain and reconnect with.
If you was in charge of legislation for a day, what would you do and why would you do it?
I think a day is difficult. So my general approach is sort of 3 areas. So we have education, we have sort of social justice, and we have tackling climate change. I think they're all interconnected. So what I do in terms of with the economy is I'd bolster a new form of state interventionism, where if we see something that's wrong in the world, it's the role of the government to step in. So if we see people in poverty, the government should step in to provide higher levels of benefits. If we see people who are losing their jobs, the government should support them while they don't have a job and also provide them a way back into employment. If we see young people who are falling behind in education, we should do something about that. And I think we need to go back to a day where the government was the way that we solve problems in society. I think over the last 40 years, like I was talking about before, we've shifted away from the idea that the government could solve problems. But let's take the NHS. It's sort of our country's favourite institution, and for good reason. People rely on it every single day during their worst moments. And it's an example of what can happen when we realise that we're far more connected than we realise. That if we put together I call it basically the idea of shared vulnerability. So whenever we all have a collective problem that we could all fairly reasonably face, we should all work together to tackle that. So another example would be homelessness. Why don't we just provide more people with homes? Why don't we just build more social housing? These are all questions of political will. We're the 6th richest country in the world. There's no reason that we have a lot of the problems that we do have today. It's because of bad decisions made by those who have power.
Okay, we're talking about austerity in the NHS. There's a lot of private, doctors that have facilities. Do you think that the government should seize them to help fight COVID-19 in work for NHS?
I think the question of seizing the almost private wait, can I start again? I think the question of seizing private medical resources is a question that I think has some wider legal and other questions which I think other people can answer. But I think it taps into a correct frustration that exists in the country around the NHS not being properly funded. As in, I think we should strive for a society where no one has to seek private healthcare. I think it's there for those who can afford it.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone who can. Most people in this country can't. I can't. But there's that thing of everyone in this country has a right to a properly funded NHS, and that's what we should focus on. That's what the government's failed to do over the last 10 years.
So your argument really is shouldn't even get to a point where you have to seize. It should just be already patterned for everyone to use properly. Thank you very much for coming again today to chat to me. It was a very good and thought-provoking conversation, and I hope you get far in your political, inshallah one day you become Prime Minister, and I hope that you inspire everyone else, young black people, that it is okay to, get to politics. Don't think that because, it's a white man's country and there's a majority of white people in the House of Parliament, that black people can't go in there and make change. Yeah,
so thank you for having me today. I think it's been a really interesting and engaging conversation. And to everyone who's watching this, I think we sit at a time in history where we can really shape what comes next, where we can decide the future, where we can restructure the economy, get better politicians, and live in a better world. And I think if you feel any kind of emotion at any injustice you see, you shouldn't just look at it and then move on. I think we should tackle it head on and really face it.
100%.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.